In 1990, my daughter Alicia walked out of our home and never came back. She was 18, just graduated with her whole life ahead of her. We told ourselves she was probably at a friend's, maybe upset over something, maybe just needing space. But by nightfall, when her room stayed quiet, her bed untouched, and her toothbrush still dry, I knew. I didn't say it out loud. I couldn't. And for 22 years, I never stepped into her room again. Before we begin, hit subscribe to help bring light to stories long buried, and make sure no name fades from memory. My name's Frank Sanders. I'm from Mornington, Oregon, a small coastal town tucked between old-growth forest and sharp Pacific cliffs. Back then, I was 41 working maintenance at the school district. My wife Elaine ran the bakery on Main. We had one child, our Alicia. Life was steady, predictable. We had dinner together every night. Sundays were for the beach or a drive inland. Alicia kept a wall calendar in her room with color-coded pens for her class scheduled test dates, even her chores. That was who she was. Bright, curious, kept everything in order. She wanted to study marine biology, loved tide pools, sea otters, anything to do with the ocean. We'd go down to Lighthouse Point in the evenings, just the two of us watching the fog roll in while she told me about plankton and barnacle colonies like they were old friends. And then one day she was gone. We searched. Every trail, every beach, every back road. Police looked into it, but leads dried up fast. There was never a body, never a clear suspect, never any answers. Just silence. Elaine packed Alicia's room up that first year, couldn't stand to see it untouched. I couldn't do it, so I shut the door, kept the window locked. Every now and then I'd glance in from the hallway, but I never crossed the threshold. Not until this spring. It was Elaine's idea. We'd been talking one night, nothing heavy, just the quiet talk you fall into after 30 years of marriage, and she said, "Maybe it's time. Maybe we let go. Donate her things. Box up the rest." So I did. One foggy morning I opened that door. The air inside was stale and still, like it had been holding its breath for 2 decades. Her posters were still on the walls, marine life, a few banned flyers. Her desk was tidy books stacked in a way only she ever did. And the smell old paper salt and something faintly floral. I didn't cry. I just stood there. I started with the clothes, folded them one by one. Her prom dress, her patched-up jeans, that blue sweater she wore every fall. Then I got to the bookshelf, and that's where I found it. Her yearbook. It was tucked behind some old science magazines. I'd never actually looked at it before, not even after she vanished. I sat on her bed, the mattress creaking under my weight, and flipped through. There she was smiling in her senior portrait like nothing could touch her. And right next to her was Amy Davidson, her best friend since 3rd grade. Below Alicia's photo, there was a short note. To Amy, don't forget to return my book. The Secret Garden Illustrated Edition. You old grandma. Love you forever. That stopped me. It was such a small thing. A teasing note between girls. But for the first time in years, something didn't feel closed. Something felt open. Amy had stopped visiting not long after the disappearance. I hadn't thought about her in years, but suddenly I needed to know. Did she ever return that book? And that's when everything began to shift. I drove across town with the yearbook on the passenger seat still open to Alicia's note about the book. It was strange how that single line had stayed with me. After all the years, I couldn't let it go. Elaine hadn't understood why it mattered. I wasn't sure I did either. But the thought of Alicia's friend Amy still holding that piece of her, it felt like something unfinished. I followed the directions Elaine had given me out past the edge of Mornington's town center to a small, quiet stretch where a few camper trailers were parked near the woods. It was a modest spot, half hidden by trees, the kind of place most people didn't notice unless they were looking for it. I parked and walked until I found the one she'd mentioned, a blue and white camper with a pot of tired daisies sitting by the door. I hesitated for a second, then knocked. When she opened the door, I didn't recognize her at first. Amy Davidson had been a teenager the last time I saw her, bright-eyed, fast-talking, always bouncing between our house and the beach with Alicia. Now she looked like someone who'd had to live through more years than she expected. Her face was lined, her hair streaked with gray, and for a moment she just looked at me like I was a stranger. Then something clicked. "Mr. Sanders?" she said, her voice soft. "It's been a long time." She stepped back, held the door open, and I followed her into the camper. The space inside was tidy, small, but homey. There were old photos taped to the walls, a few worn books, and a pair of mugs drying on the counter. She offered me coffee, and I said sure. We sat across from each other at the little table, steam curling up from the mugs, and she looked down at the yearbook when I set it between us. "I remember this," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the cover. I turned to Alicia's profile page and pointed to the message she'd written. Amy read it, smiled faintly, and nodded. She always called me Grandma when I forgot stuff. I asked if she ever returned the book, and Amy stood without a word, walked to a low cabinet near her bed, and opened it. After a bit of searching, she pulled out a copy of The Secret Garden Illustrated Edition, just like Alicia had mentioned. The edges were worn, the spine cracked, but she held it with a kind of reverence. "I never gave it back," she said. "After she disappeared, I just couldn't let go of it. It's the last thing of hers I have." She offered it to me, but I shook my head. "No," I told her. "You keep it." I flipped it open anyway, just to look. Tucked inside was a torn page from a teen fashion magazine folded in half like a bookmark. The image was of a young male model, probably no older than Alicia had been at the time, posed in a summer outfit. Something about him looked familiar. I pointed to the photo and asked, "Do you know who this is?" Amy leaned over. "Jason Murray," she said. "He was in our class." The name clicked. I remembered seeing him in the yearbook vaguely. Amy told me he'd been modeling back then. Still did, apparently now ran his own fashion line. "You were dating him, weren't you?" I asked, thinking back to something Elaine had once mentioned in passing. Amy's expression changed right away. "No," she said firmly. "I never dated Jason. Didn't even like him, honestly. That caught me off guard." "I thought he was Alicia's friend," I said. "Or at least someone she mentioned." Amy shrugged. "Back in junior year, yeah, he had a thing for her. But it didn't last. We both thought he was kind of off. After a while, we kept our distance." She paused, then looked down at the table. "Although, there were a few times senior year when she talked to him again. I remember thinking it was strange. She asked me what I thought about him, if maybe he wasn't as bad as we thought. Wanted me to drive past his house once so she could see where he lived. I thought she was just being curious. She always wanted to believe people could be better. I asked if the police had looked into Jason back then. Amy nodded. They questioned everyone in our class, including him, but Alicia was dating Brandon Knox at the time, so he was the main focus. I remembered Brandon. He used to come by the house, seemed like a decent kid. He had an alibi, though, I said. "Yeah," Amy replied. "And after she disappeared, he couldn't take the pressure. Left town. But Jason stayed. Grew his business. Built a name. Lived quietly from what Amy had heard." I stared at the photo again. Why would Alicia use his picture as a bookmark? Amy reached across and took the book back, unfolded the page. This was from her favorite magazine, she said. I hated Jason, and she knew it. She tore this out just to tease me. Said it was the only thing it was good for. I asked if she knew where Jason lived now. Amy pulled out her phone, scrolled through a few messages, and showed me an address. "Our class reunion was at his house last weekend," she said. "I didn't go, but some people shared the location in the alumni group chat." I wrote it down. Before I left, Amy asked me to tell Elaine she said hello. She held the book close to her chest and whispered, "Thank you for letting me keep it. It means more than you know." I stepped out into the daylight, still trying to make sense of it all. A name that had never come up in any of the case files. A boy Alicia had hidden from us. A magazine page folded into a children's book she never got back. I sat in the car, staring down at the address on my phone, debating whether I should go straight home. Elaine had expected me to be back by now. We were supposed to spend the afternoon packing up the last of Alicia's things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about Jason Murray didn't add up. I called Detective Ron Keller. He'd been assigned to Alicia's case all those years ago, but his phone went to voicemail. I hung up and started the engine. 20 minutes later, I found myself driving into one of Mornington's wealthier neighborhoods. Long driveways, white fences, well-kept lawns. Jason's house stood out even among the rest, 2 stories, circular drive, big windows facing the sea. I parked down the road out of view and waited. It wasn't long before the front door opened. Jason stepped outside with a woman younger, maybe late 20s. They spoke for a moment, then he kissed her cheek, sent her off, and turned back toward the house. As he looked up, his eyes landed directly on my car. I realized too late that I hadn't thought it through. My car wasn't tinted, and I was parked like I was waiting to ambush someone. Jason's posture changed immediately. His whole body tensed. I opened my door and walked toward the gate. "Good afternoon," I said, trying to sound casual. "You're Jason Murray, right?" He didn't answer right away, just stared. "Who are you and why are you watching my house?" he asked, voice sharp. "I'm Frank Sanders, Alicia Sanders' father. You were in her graduating class." Jason's expression hardened. "What do you want?" I told him I'd heard they were once close, that I was just trying to understand the last months of my daughter's life. From who he asked. Amy. She didn't even show up to the reunion. I stayed calm, told him I wasn't there to start anything. I just wanted to ask about Alicia. Jason's tone changed. Defensive. Cold. "I barely knew her," he snapped. "Never dated her. Told the police that already. Don't appreciate being questioned again. I hadn't even suggested dating. But the way he emphasized it so quickly, so harshly, it didn't sit right. He kept talking, brushing me off, saying he needed homework help once, maybe borrowed money. Nothing else. But he couldn't stop fidgeting. His weight shifted. His eyes darted to the street like he was worried someone would see us. "I have a reputation now," he muttered. "Don't need reporters spreading rumors." He turned and walked back to the house, telling me I should leave. Said he had nothing else to say about Alicia. I stood there for a long time after he went inside. Something about his reaction didn't feel like grief or discomfort. It felt like fear. I drove off, but I didn't go home. I didn't call Elaine. I found myself heading toward the funeral home in town. If we were really going to let go, I thought maybe we should plan something, some kind of service, even without a body. I picked up a few brochures. But when I stepped back outside, something across the street stopped me cold. Jason Murray, walking out of a hardware store, shovel in one hand, a small wooden box in the other. A few minutes later, he came out of the flower shop next door. White hyacinths, Alicia's favorite. He didn't see me, got in his car and drove off, and without thinking, I followed. He turned left off the main road, heading toward the bluffs. I stayed a few car lengths behind, far enough not to catch his attention. That stretch of coastline wasn't somewhere people usually visited in early spring, too cold, too damp, and the wind off the water cut straight through you. But Jason drove like he had a purpose. When he pulled off onto a private gravel drive that curved toward a lone cottage, I kept going, drove another 100 yards, then parked beneath the trees. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment. The wooden box, the shovel, the hyacinths. All of it sat heavy in my mind. I waited until I saw him disappear through the cottage door, before I stepped out and moved down the slope, staying off the main path. From behind a cluster of scrub pine, I watched as he came out again with a garden trolley. The box was inside. So were the flowers. He started walking away from the house, following a footpath that led out toward the edge of the cliffs. I kept low, following parallel through the brush. The path wound along the bluff's edge, uneven and narrow in places, overgrown in others. Eventually, it opened up to a wide clearing with a full view of the Pacific. He stopped there, looked around, waited, then set down the box and started digging. The soil was packed hard, more rock than dirt. It took effort, but he worked like he'd done this before, methodical, quiet. I stayed behind a large boulder near the edge of the clearing, close enough to see, but not hear. After a while, he stopped, reached into the box. From where I stood, I couldn't see what he held, but the way he looked at it, staring for long stretches, flipping through something in his hands. It wasn't casual. It looked personal. He pulled out a few sheets of paper, maybe letters, maybe photographs. A gust of wind came up and a handful slipped free. He swore under his breath and scrambled to catch them before they blew off the cliff. When he finally managed to collect them all, he placed the bouquet on top of the box and started filling in the hole. When he was done, he stood for a moment silent, his hands at his sides. Then I heard him say it, just above the sound of the waves. "I think you can hold these memories now, Alicia." My foot slipped against a patch of gravel. I caught myself against the tree beside me, but I didn't move, didn't breathe. His head jerked up and he stared straight toward the tree line. "Hello," he called. "Someone there?" He took a few steps forward, scanning the clearing. The shovel was still in his hand. I stayed still. He stood there a while longer, listening. Then he muttered something to himself, something about the wind, and backed off. But instead of returning down the path, he started walking the perimeter of the clearing, circling around like he was checking for movement. I ducked low and stayed behind the rocks until I saw him turn and walk back to the cottage. He leaned the shovel against the siding and disappeared inside. Then minutes later, his car pulled out and headed back the way he came. I counted to 100 before I moved. My hands were shaking a little, but my mind was clear. I walked out to the fresh dirt and looked down at the mound. The soil was damp, newly packed. I couldn't walk away. I had to know what he buried. I circled back to the cottage, grabbed the shovel, and returned to the clearing. Each time the blade hit the earth, I expected to hear a car or footsteps or his voice, but the only sound was the wind moving through the pines and the ocean below. I dug slowly, careful not to damage whatever was inside. The first thing I saw was the flowers flattened slightly by the weight of the soil. I set them aside. Then the tip of the shovel hit wood. I cleared it by hand the rest of the way. And then, behind me, I heard him. "I knew someone was out there," he said. I turned, and Jason was standing just beyond the rocks, not 10 feet away. I was right. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. "You shouldn't have come back." He started walking toward me. I stayed where I was, one hand still on the shovel. "I heard what you said." I told him. "You said her name. What is this? What are you burying out here?" He stopped a few feet from me, looked down at the disturbed soil, then back at me. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "You don't know what this is." I started to turn back toward the box, but he shouted, "Don't touch that," and when I didn't stop, he pulled a gun. "Drop the shovel," he said. I let go of the handle, raised my hand slowly. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I moved carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to call the police," I said. "You can shoot me if you want, but I'm pressing that button first." I reached for the phone, but before I could hit the screen, he lunged. The phone slipped from my fingers, hit the ground, and skidded toward the edge of the cliff. We both looked at it. He moved to grab it, but I kicked the gun from his hand, sending it flying over the ledge. Then I dove after the phone. Just caught it before it went over, hit the emergency button without even looking. He rushed me again this time, grabbing me by the collar and driving me backward. "Stop this," I said, trying to break free. You said her name. That's my daughter. Tell me what's going on. He was breathing hard now, not shouting, but wild in the eyes. You don't understand, he said. I still have my whole life ahead of me. I can't lose it. Not because of this. Not now. I asked him again if he hurt her, if he killed Alicia. His face twisted and he said, she should have stayed away. I never knew what I felt for her, but she wouldn't stop. She kept coming back. And you were her father. You should have protected her. Then he was on me, one hand around my throat, pressing me into the dirt. The air cut off fast. I tried to push him off, but I didn't have the strength. Then, somewhere beyond the trees, the faint sound of sirens broke through the wind. He hesitated. That second was enough. His grip loosened. He looked toward the noise panic blooming across his face. I rolled free, coughing hard. When the officers arrived, they were shouting commands, weapons drawn. Jason dropped to his knees, hands raised. They cuffed him without a fight. One of the officers came over to me, asked if I was okay. I nodded. I pointed toward the mound. He buried something, said Alicia's name. My daughter went missing 22 years ago. The officer's eyes changed like she recognized the name. Sanders, she said. Hang tight. Let me get someone over here. Minutes later, a detective introduced herself, Ramirez. She took my statement quietly, without judgment. I told her everything, from the yearbook to the flowers to the fight at the edge of the cliff. She listened, then looked over at the disturbed earth. Let's see what's in the box, she said. The forensics team moved in carefully. The first thing they lifted was the bouquet. Then they opened the wooden box. Inside was a stack of papers, notes, printed messages, a few old photographs, and something that looked like a doll made from yarn and wool. The detective reached in with gloved hands and pulled out the top page. She read for a while, then looked at me. These messages, she said, they're between Alicia and Jason. Looks like they had a secret relationship for almost a year. I stared down at the open box, unsure what to say. She told him she believed in him. Ramirez continued, that he could be better. But it turns dark toward the end. I didn't respond. I just listened. And beside that box, half buried in damp soil, was the thing I'd spent over 2 decades trying to find. Not answers, not closure, but the moment when silence breaks, when something hidden finally starts to speak. And I knew right then, we weren't done yet. Not even close. The next morning I woke before the sun. Elaine was still asleep, the bedroom dark and quiet, her breathing steady beside me. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that box, about Jason, about what it meant that my daughter had written those messages, some hopeful, some pleading, some so full of doubt I could barely hold the words in my mind. I hadn't slept much. My throat still ached where he'd grabbed me, and the image of him pressing the dirt down over Alicia's things kept repeating in my head. I could still hear his voice. You can hold these memories now. Later that morning, Detective Ramirez called. She told me they were beginning a wider search of the property and the surrounding woods. She said they'd start looking for disturbed soil or anything else that stood out. Her tone was calm but clipped. Professional. She thanked me again for pressing the emergency alert when I did. Said if I hadn't, things might have gone a different way. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold in front of me. Elaine came in just as the sun started to break through the clouds. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. You didn't come home last night, she said quietly. I nodded. I went out to the bluffs. I followed Jason. Her expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. I told her what had happened carefully, step by step, the way you would read from a report. When I got to the part about the wooden box and what the officers found inside, she sat down across from me and didn't speak for a long time. I thought we were done searching, she finally said. I thought we were going to let her go. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. That afternoon, I went back to Alicia's room. I stood in the doorway unsure whether I'd be able to walk in again, but I did. I pulled open her desk drawers, flipped through her school folders, trying to piece together anything that might connect to Jason. There wasn't much. A few receipts from the bookstore, a note from one of her teachers. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I kept going because part of me still didn't understand how Elaine and I had missed all of it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the timeline didn't sit right. Alicia had been dating Brandon Knox when she disappeared. Everyone remembered that. They'd been together for months. I remembered how often he used to come to the house, how she'd get quiet whenever I asked about him. But the messages in that box, they didn't end when Jason faded from her life. They kept going. There were pages printouts where Jason had responded days, maybe even weeks before she vanished. I didn't know where he'd gotten her number or why she'd replied, but something kept drawing her back in. I called Amy that evening. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I could, careful not to share more than the detectives might have wanted. But I needed to ask. "Do you remember Alicia saying anything about going out to that cottage?" I asked. Ever mentioning the cliffs, Amy was quiet. "No," she said. "She never told me anything about Jason after junior year. I thought she was done with him. She started dating Brandon, and that was it." There was a pause, and then she said something that stopped me. "But I do remember. There was one night she asked me to drive past his old house. She said she wanted to see if he still lived there. She didn't get out of the car, didn't say a word the whole time, just stared. I asked her when that was. She didn't remember exactly. Late spring, she said. Right before graduation. After we hung up, I walked out to the porch and sat alone, listening to the wind move through the trees. That was the part I kept coming back to. Alicia had spent her whole life telling us everything. If she'd been hurt or afraid or unsure about someone, we thought we would have known. But maybe she didn't want us to know. Maybe she believed deep down that she could handle it herself. The next day, Detective Ramirez called again. They were still reviewing the messages. She said many were fragmented, some old enough that the formatting was poor, some partially water-damaged. But the ones that stood out were Alicia's. She'd written things like, "I believe you can change, and I want to trust you, but I can't lie for you." Another message read, "I can't keep this secret anymore. I'm telling someone." The detective's voice shifted slightly when she read that one. "That last message was dated 5 days before Alicia disappeared," she said. "It wasn't sent by text. It looks like it was written in a journal and later typed out, probably by Jason." I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and didn't say anything. Ramirez told me they were bringing in a forensic psychologist to review the rest of the writings. She said some of them might qualify as a kind of diary obsessive repetitive notes Jason had written to Alicia, even after she stopped responding. She said that kind of behavior wasn't uncommon in coercive relationships. It was usually hard to spot unless someone knew exactly what to look for. I thanked her, and we ended the call. I didn't tell Elaine everything. Not that night. She was already starting to sleep a little easier. The tension that had hovered over the house for so many years had shifted somehow, and I didn't want to pull her back into it. But I couldn't stop myself. I went back through Alicia's belongings again. Her backpack, her drawers. I started checking the attic, the garage boxes we hadn't opened in years. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a letter, a second journal, something she never had the chance to send. A few days later, Ramirez reached out again. They had a judge sign off on a full warrant for Jason's cottage and property. She told me they'd be expanding the ground search, bringing in cadaver dogs and geological scanners. They would be looking for anomalies, disturbed earth changes in vegetation, subtle shifts in soil composition. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with someone who just snapped. This wasn't an accident. Jason hadn't just panicked. He'd planned. And if he buried her out there somewhere near that bluff, then there was a chance her remains could still be recovered. For the first time in 22 years, I felt the edge of something close to a truth. But I also felt something else, the weight of not knowing what my daughter had carried alone, the silence she must have endured. And for the first time, I wondered if we had pushed harder, listened more closely. Would any of this have changed? The search was set to begin at dawn. I told the detective I wanted to be there. Not to interfere, just to stand nearby. Watch the ground open up if it came to that. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, but I also knew I couldn't look away anymore. They started at first light. I arrived just after the sun came up the sky, still pale and gray over the bluffs. The forensic team had already set up a perimeter around the cottage and the overlook beyond it. Orange flags marked every 10 feet along the path, and a scent dog was working slow circles through the scrub nose to the ground, its handler moving patiently behind it. Detective Ramirez met me at the edge of the clearing. She handed me a cup of coffee and told me I could stay as long as I didn't interfere. I told her I wouldn't say a word. I just wanted to be nearby. We stood in silence for a while, watching the team begin their survey equipment clicking and beeping softly as they measured changes in elevation and soil resistance. She said it would take time. The ground in this part of the coast held moisture differently, so it could hide what had been moved or buried unless you knew exactly what to look for. I stayed back near the trees and let the professionals do their work. Watching them comb over the land reminded me of that first week back in 1990 when the search for Alicia began. Back then, it had been volunteers with flashlights and dogs walking shoulder to shoulder through the woods. Now it was quiet, measured, clinical. Still, every time someone paused or bent to examine the ground, I held my breath. Most of the morning passed that way. Around 10, Ramirez came over with a box from Jason's cottage. They'd started cataloging items inside, and she thought I might be able to identify something. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Inside were things Alicia had owned, small personal items we thought had been lost or packed away. A scarf she used to wear on rainy days, a library card, a cassette tape labeled in her handwriting, and at the bottom, carefully wrapped in old tissue paper, was a homemade wool doll, something she'd made in elementary school back when she went through that phase of making little crafts for everyone in the family. She had given this one to me on Father's Day, and I remembered placing it on my bookshelf in the den. At some point, it disappeared. I always assumed it had gotten lost during one of our spring cleanings, but here it was, sealed away in a box in Jason Murray's house. I asked Ramirez where exactly they'd found it. She said it had been stored in a low drawer in a bedroom closet under a stack of clothing that didn't belong to Jason. Some of the items were women's sizes, sweaters, a pair of shoes, a denim jacket. They were collecting them now for DNA testing. I asked her how that kind of thing could go unnoticed all these years, and she said it wasn't uncommon. People who keep things like that don't always display them. They're buried, hidden, saved for themselves, not for show. Not long after that, one of the technicians motioned the team over to a spot about 15 feet from the overlook. The ground there looked like the rest. Rocky, patchy grass, a few low shrubs, but the lead forensic tech said the density readings were off. Something had been disturbed and covered again. A second team moved in with smaller tools and began excavating. I didn't go over right away. Ramirez stayed with me, said they'd let us know as soon as there was something to report. It took another hour before someone called out. When they did, the tone changed. Everything slowed. The team moved carefully now, hands gloved, eyes locked on the ground. And then I saw it one of the techs stood up holding a small bone fragment no bigger than a spoon. She showed it to the detective, who nodded once quietly. Ramirez walked over to me and didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "We found remains." I don't remember what I said back. I know I didn't cry. I think I nodded. My legs didn't want to hold me up, but I didn't sit down either. I stayed where I was, watching the team clear the dirt layer by layer. More fragments followed. Pieces of clothing. a scrap of floral fabric I recognized from one of Alicia's dresses. It was real now. It had weight. Ramirez placed a call to Elaine and asked if she wanted to come. I told her not to sugarcoat anything, just tell her what we found and let her decide. Amy arrived about an hour later before Elaine did. She looked pale, shaken, but when she saw me standing near the tree line, she walked over and took my hand. The three of us stood together as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting shadows across the dig site. I don't know how long we were there. The air felt still. The only sound was the rustling of gloves, the careful brushing of soil. At one point, Amy whispered, "Why didn't she tell me I didn't answer?" There wasn't one. She said, "We used to talk about everything, even the stupid stuff. Boys, teachers, what kind of car we wanted. How could I not have seen it?" Elaine arrived late in the afternoon. She didn't cry either. She stepped out of the car, looked across the field, and walked straight to me. I told her it was confirmed that the forensic team was documenting everything and that we'd have a clearer picture in a few days. She nodded and kept her eyes on the ground. Later, as the sun began to drop and the team packed up for the day, she said quietly, "We're taking her home. No matter what it takes. She's not staying here another night in this place." Ramirez promised us the remains would be transported to the state lab, but once they'd completed their analysis, Alicia would be released back to us. Elaine said she didn't want a cemetery plot. She belongs to the ocean, she said. She always did. I didn't argue. That night back at the house, I sat on the edge of Alicia's bed again, the same place I'd been the day I found the yearbook. It hadn't changed, but I had. The not knowing had ruled our lives for so long that I'd forgotten what certainty felt like. And now that it was here, I didn't know how to hold it. Elaine came in after a while and sat beside me. She held a framed photo of Alicia, one of the candid ones, not the senior portrait. It showed her laughing hair blowing sideways, a tide pool in the background. Elaine didn't speak, just placed the frame gently on the bed. Then she said, "I don't want to bury what he did, but I do want to bury her in peace." We didn't talk about Jason that night. We didn't need to. But in the silence, I thought again about that book, the one Amy had kept all those years. The Secret Garden. Alicia had wanted her to return it. Maybe not because she needed it back, but because it meant something between them hadn't been closed yet. And I started to wonder if Alicia had hidden parts of her life from the people closest to her. What else might still be out there? Not in a box or beneath the dirt, but in memory, in silence, in the pages no one ever thought to read. They gave us 2 days before returning to the site. The forensic team had done a surface-level excavation, but Ramirez said there were still inconsistencies in the ground layers farther out, small depressions that didn't show up on satellite maps from years prior. She explained they would be using ground-penetrating radar next. The goal was to make sure no one missed anything. I appreciated her caution, but I could feel a shift. This wasn't about recovery anymore. This was investigation. It was about Jason and what else he might have hidden. I stayed out of the way as they worked, but I watched everything. It was a slow process, section by section. They swept the soil with the radar wand, pausing over anything that looked irregular. A few times they marked spots with flags, and one of the techs would dig shallow test holes with a hand trowel. Most of it came up empty. But around mid-afternoon, someone flagged Ramirez down near the edge of the woods, just off the main trail that led back to the cottage. I saw her crouch low, her hand moving through what looked like pine needles and loose topsoil. Then she stood and looked in my direction. She didn't call me over right away, but when she finally walked back, she was holding a small object wrapped in a forensic cloth. "We found this maybe 15 feet from the burial site," she said. "Could be nothing, but it was tucked under a few inches of dirt near the root bed." She unwrapped it. Inside was a compact mirror, cheap plastic, the kind you'd find in a teenager's purse. It was cracked across the glass and smeared with old dirt, but I recognized it immediately. Alicia had one just like it, bright yellow with a daisy on the lid. She used to carry it in her backpack, always checking her bangs in it before school. I hadn't seen it since she disappeared. Ramirez didn't ask me to confirm it. I think she could tell by my face. Later that evening, after the team packed up and we returned to town, Ramirez invited me to the station. She said there were more items from the box we hadn't gone through yet, things that needed context. She had cleared out a small interview room, laid out folders and evidence bags across the table, and let me take my time. Most of what I saw was difficult to process fragments of pages torn from notebooks, some printed emails, and several old photographs, the kind that had to be developed at a drugstore. Most were of landscapes, beaches, cliffs, ocean views. But one taken from the interior of the cottage showed a girl with her back to the camera sitting on the edge of a bed. Her posture was slumped, her arms pulled around her stomach like she was cold. You couldn't see her face, but her hair was unmistakable. Long, wavy, with the same uneven trim she always gave herself with dull scissors in the bathroom mirror. I asked Ramirez where the photo came from. She said it had been inside a manila envelope at the bottom of the wooden box. No date, no writing on the back, just that single image. I asked her if they could confirm when it was taken. She said not precisely, but the photo paper type had been discontinued in the late 1990s. That placed it close, possibly within days or weeks of Alicia's disappearance. I went home that night with the envelope still in my mind. I sat in the living room with Elaine. She didn't ask me about the photo, and I didn't offer. We just sat there, the television on, but muted. Around 9, Amy called. She said she'd been thinking there was something that had been bothering her. Back in their senior year, Alicia had skipped school once. Just a single day. Not something she usually did. Amy had assumed it was nerves about graduation, or maybe a fight with Brandon. But now she wondered, could that have been the day she went out to the cottage? I asked her if she remembered which month it happened. May, she said, near the end of the year. That lined up. Alicia had disappeared in early June, just weeks later. I thanked her, and after we hung up, I found myself walking to the back of the house. There was a storage bin in the hall closet, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were a few of Alicia's school calendars, monthly ones she used to keep on the corkboard above her desk. One from her senior year had a day marked in yellow highlighter library off campus, but she never checked out a book that day. I called Ramirez the next morning. She said they could pull old traffic camera data from town, but 1990 was a long time ago. Still, she'd ask someone in records to try. While we waited, Ramirez told me they'd started going through Jason's phone. Most of it had been wiped, but the techs were working on restoring old backups. She said one of the strangest things they found was a folder labeled Garden. Inside were scanned pages from Alicia's notes and journals. A few were copied line by line. Others were reworded like he'd tried to rewrite her thoughts in his own language. One page read, "She said she wouldn't tell. She looked me in the eye and said she forgave me. That's when I knew she still loved me." The file was dated almost 2 years after her disappearance. That detail stayed with me. The fact that he was still writing to her, still documenting her voice like she was present. It was disturbing, yes, but more than that, it meant that whatever happened between them hadn't ended at the moment she vanished. At least, not for him. He was keeping her alive in his mind, preserving her, folding her voice into his. I went for a walk that night just to clear my head, down by the lighthouse. The fog was low, curling around the rocks like smoke. I found myself staring out at the sea, and I thought about how small that cottage looked from the water, like it wasn't part of anything, just a dot on the edge of the world. I wondered if Alicia had looked out from that same spot, if she'd stood at the cliff's edge and thought about calling for help, or if she ever believed she'd make it home. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing the phrase in my head. She forgave me. It didn't sound like Alicia, not the girl who once wrote letters to the editor about endangered species, or who stood up in front of the school board when the biology lab refused to order updated textbooks. She wasn't passive. She didn't just accept harm. So either Jason had rewritten her words, or he'd imagined them entirely. The next morning, Ramirez called again. They'd found a second wooden box buried beneath a stone slab behind the cottage, one that hadn't shifted much over time. It was sealed tight, water-damaged, but intact. She said they were opening it that afternoon. She didn't say what she thought might be inside. She didn't have to, and I knew I'd be there when they did. The box was heavier than anyone expected. It had been buried flat beneath a thick slab of stone wedged into the earth like someone wanted it to vanish for good. It took 2 officers and a crowbar to lift the lid. Ramirez didn't let me get close at first protocol, she said, but I stood in the doorway of the forensic tent and watched everything. Inside, they found a blanket first, wool-striped frayed at the edges. Ramirez held it up with gloved hands. Then came the notebooks, 4 of them. Not store-bought, but handmade, stitched together with fishing line. The pages inside were uneven, some torn from old journals, some from printer paper. On the cover of one, written in careful cursive, were the words, Book 1. No date, no name, just that. They scanned the first few pages there on site, flipping through with slow, deliberate hands. Ramirez turned to me and asked if Alicia ever kept a diary. I told her I wasn't sure. She used to write in the margins of her textbooks, sometimes jot thoughts into a school planner, but she never shared anything personal. Elaine said once that Alicia was like her mother, that way, private interior. I asked if I could see one of the pages. Ramirez hesitated, then handed me a scan-out of the first entry. The paper smelled faintly of mildew. The handwriting wasn't Alicia's. It was neater, more deliberate. At the top of the page in block print it said, Day 4. She stopped speaking. I don't know how long I stared at that line. The entry below it described a routine 2 meals short walks monitored time by the window. It read like someone documenting an animal. Today she accepted the eggs but refused the toast. No screaming, no talking. Eyes stayed closed. There was no name used, but every detail pointed to a girl kept inside, observed daily. I asked how many pages were like this. Ramirez said the books spanned close to a year. Then she looked at me and said gently, he was writing to himself, or maybe to justify it. But this isn't a confession. It's a record. The more they read, the clearer it became. Jason had kept Alicia alive, hidden for an extended period. The cottage was only part of it. According to the notebooks, he moved her several times. Once to a shed he called the warm room, once to what he described as the root cellar by the West Trail. That last location wasn't listed on any map. We searched for hours before finding it a low concrete bunker dug into the hillside, mostly covered by vines and sand. The door had rusted shut. Inside were more of Alicia's things. A cracked Polaroid, a shoe, a water-stained paperback of Wuthering Heights with her name still faintly visible inside the cover. There were scratch marks on the interior wall, tallied lines, dozens of them, etched just below eye level. I stood in that small room longer than I should have. The air was damp, full of earth and iron and rot. It didn't feel like a place where someone lived. It felt like waiting. Elaine came down with us the next morning once the path had been cleared. She didn't say anything when she stepped inside, just took it all in. After a while, she reached out, touched the spine of the book, and whispered, she read this in school, hated the ending. Then she turned and walked out. Amy couldn't bring herself to enter. She stayed at the tree line, arms folded tight across her chest, rocking slightly like she was bracing against wind. Ramirez had someone from behavioral analysis review the notebooks. They confirmed what we already suspected. Jason was fixated on Alicia not just as a person, but as an idea. He referred to her as the keeper more than once. He believed she held something sacred. There were passages that described dreams where she forgave him, offered him water, smiled while saying his name. There were also entries that hinted at punishments. Long silences, removal of light food withheld for days. But never rage. It was always written like maintenance, correction, control. I asked Ramirez if any of it would hold up in court had Jason lived. She said maybe. Enough for a psychiatric review, definitely enough for kidnapping and unlawful confinement. But the rest? It would have been complicated. No cameras, no witnesses, just the words of a man who wasn't here to defend or explain himself. She paused before saying the next part. But we're not here to convict a ghost. We're here to tell the truth. Amy spent that night at our place. She didn't want to be alone. After Elaine went to bed, we sat in the kitchen. I poured her tea and she opened her laptop. Said she'd found something strange in the digital archives, an old message board for alumni of the local high school. In a thread from 1999, someone had posted a blurry photo of a girl standing outside a thrift store in Oregon. The post was titled, "Does this look like Alicia H?" The replies were skeptical. Some cruel. One person claimed to be Alicia herself, but the syntax felt off too flat, robotic. Another comment just said, "Leave her alone. She's free now." Then the account was deleted. Amy said she thought about ignoring it, but something about the photo nagged her. She asked if we had access to any of Alicia's old clothing, anything that might match. I remembered a red canvas jacket from a camping trip. Elaine found it boxed away with Alicia's childhood things. In the photo, the girl wore the same jacket, same embroidery on the shoulder. Ramirez agreed to run the image through facial recognition. It wasn't conclusive, but the match confidence came back at 78%. Too low for evidence. High enough to ask questions. That's when the theory shifted. Maybe Jason hadn't killed her immediately. Maybe she got out. Maybe someone helped her. Or maybe she escaped on her own. The records from the cottage stopped abruptly after the fourth notebook. No final entry. No closure. Just one last line dated 364 days in. She looked at the door and said, "Tomorrow." That was it. No follow-up. No reaction. The next pages were blank. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Amy. Around 3 a.m., she whispered from the couch, "What if she's still out there?" I didn't answer. I just watched the light from the porch cast long shadows against the floorboards. For the first time since we'd found the remains, I wasn't sure who we were mourning. A girl who had died too young, or a woman who had survived and chose to disappear. The article came out on a Sunday. Front page, just under the fold, unsealed files. Point to pattern of grooming abuse by missing local man. It had been written by a journalist from Portland who'd followed the case from the beginning, one of the only ones who'd ever asked for interviews off the record, who'd bothered to call Alicia by her full name, instead of referring to her as the missing girl. The article laid out everything the sheriff's office had confirmed over the past few months. That Jason had been the focus of a reopened investigation in the late 90s. That 2 other girls, one from a nearby school, one from a camp where he worked part-time, had come forward with disturbing reports. That those reports had been dismissed or quietly filed away. And that one of them, now an adult living in Colorado, had finally agreed to speak with investigators again after hearing what was found at the cottage. Her name was withheld, but she shared details that hadn't been made public, specific items in Jason's house phrases he'd used, even the way he kept a daily journal on index cards taped to the inside of his medicine cabinet. The story confirmed what many of us already feared: Alicia wasn't the first, and there was a real chance she hadn't been the last. After the article broke, the sheriff's office received dozens of calls. Some were from people claiming to remember seeing Alicia after she vanished. Most were dead ends. But a few came from women who had been teenagers in the area back then. Girls who'd been dismissed, ignored, or labeled dramatic for sounding the alarm. They'd remembered Jason all right. Remembered the way he watched from the library steps, or how he'd offer rides home if it was raining, always with that calm, trustworthy voice. One said she once saw him talking to Alicia outside the grocery store just days before the girl went missing. She told her mother, but nothing came of it. I started to see a pattern in the way they talked, like each of them had carried a separate piece of the puzzle for years, unsure if it mattered, unsure if they'd be believed. One woman sent me a letter handwritten "No return address." Inside were a few lines about Alicia, then a sentence I won't forget. He made us feel like we were the ones who had done something wrong. Ramirez called me that same week. They'd confirmed that Jason had used aliases during several out-of-state trips, including one to New Mexico in 1998. He'd stayed at a cabin under a false name for 2 weeks, just miles from a police station. No one thought to check it back then. It had only come up now because one of the scanned pages from his journals mentioned the elevation and temperature of a new retreat. The forensic team cross-referenced that with regional weather logs and came up with a match. There'd been a name scribbled into the visitor ledger, Alan B. Ramirez said that same alias had come up on an old storage unit rental in Idaho. That unit had been cleared out years ago, but the receipt showed a payment made with a cashier's check drawn from a bank account that Jason's family never knew existed. It had stayed dormant since 2001. That's when everything seemed to stop. No more sightings, no more bank activity, and no trace of Alicia. Still, it raised a chilling possibility. Had he planned to run? Was there someone else he meant to hide? What the detectives couldn't determine was whether Alicia ever left with him, or if someone else did. The journal stopped. The trail ended. But in the fourth notebook there was a page torn halfway out. On what remained just 5 words. "She will not return again." That line unsettled me more than anything else. It sounded final, but not violent. Like he'd lost control. Like she had chosen to leave. And it changed the way I started to think about the last few years of her life. Not just as a victim, but as someone surviving under impossible conditions, resisting however she could. If Alicia had escaped, if she'd somehow made it out, then maybe everything after wasn't silence. Maybe it was distance. Chosen. Earned. Elaine didn't want to speculate. She'd stopped reading the papers altogether, refused to talk about the press coverage. It doesn't bring her back, she'd say. But Amy and I kept following the case. We weren't chasing hope anymore. We were tracking patterns, looking for the quiet ways women disappear, the ways they're buried without ever being put in the ground. There was one more development. Ramirez received an anonymous tip, a voicemail, no caller ID. A male voice filtered through distortion said, "Check the north wall." That was it. They traced the call to a burner phone near Port Angeles. It pinged once, then went silent. No one could confirm its origin, but the phrasing caught Ramirez's attention. The north wall wasn't a public detail. Only those of us who'd been inside the cellar knew that one side had newer drywall, a section that looked like it had been replaced after water damage. It had never been opened out of respect for what had already been found. 2 days later, a team went back. They carefully removed the paneling. Behind it was a shallow cavity barely wide enough to fit a person sitting up. Inside were scraps of cloth, bundled paper, and a length of nylon rope. And at the base, buried under loose soil, they found a ring. Silver delicate, the kind a teenager might wear on a chain. It had the letter A carved into the underside. I recognized it. Alicia had worn it for years, said she found it at a thrift store, and liked that it didn't look too fancy. Ramirez didn't say anything as she handed it to me in an evidence pouch. She just looked at me like she was sorry. After that, things moved quickly. The press held a second wave of coverage, this time focused on the victims. Not just Alicia, but the others. Their stories finally pulled into the open. The sheriff's office issued a formal statement acknowledging the failures of the past. A task force was created to look into cold cases tied to the region. None of that changed what had already happened, but it did something. It named what had been unnamed. It made people listen. I stood by Alicia's grave a week later. They'd placed a new marker, one that read her full name. The dates for now were left open. No one could confirm when she died, or even if she had. It was a quiet ceremony. Just me, Elaine, Amy, and the sheriff. No press, no announcements, just a few words, a few tears, and wind moving through the trees like breath held too long. As we turned to leave, I looked back at the stone and thought about that line. She will not return again. Maybe it meant exactly what it said. Maybe Alicia chose to walk away from everything. From Jason. From us. From a world that didn't protect her when it mattered most. And maybe that was the closest thing to justice she could claim. They never found a body. No bones, no remains. Just the ring, the scraps in the wall, and silence. I used to think that meant we'd never get closure. That justice needed a grave, a date, something carved in stone to count. But the older I get, the more I understand that justice is sometimes just truth being spoken aloud and finally believed. And for Alicia, that truth came in pieces. In the women who stepped forward. In the articles, the records unsealed. In the quiet voices who refused to stay quiet any longer. Elaine and I still live in the same house. We thought about moving once years ago, but something always kept us here. Maybe it was the coast. Maybe it was Alicia. Her room is empty now, cleared out except for one small bookshelf and the photo she took at Lighthouse Point. It's framed by the window where the fog rolls in every morning like clockwork. Some mornings I sit in there with the door open and the window cracked just enough to let in the salt air. It doesn't feel haunted, just still. Amy moved out of state not long after the second article ran. She never said it directly, but I think the weight of it, the guilt, the pressure of being the one who remembered it just gotta be too much. We still talk every Christmas. She sends postcards sometimes, usually from the coast. Always says, the ocean's still here. I think that's her way of saying Alicia's still here too, in a way. As for Ramirez, she stayed on with the sheriff's department through the task force. We've talked a few times since everything came to light. She told me that cases like this change the way departments handle missing teens now, especially when girls go missing without a trace. She said Alicia's name has come up in training seminars, in lectures, in policy changes. That used to feel strange to me, like she was becoming a case file instead of a daughter, but now I see it differently. Alicia isn't lost in those mentions. She's being carried forward. There are things I'll never know. Whether Alicia was kept in that cellar or somewhere else. Whether she escaped. Whether she left on her own or if someone helped her disappear. But I don't ask those questions as much anymore. What I hold on to now is this: she fought. However long she lived, wherever she went, she resisted. Even the way the journals ended with that torn page and those 5 words. It told me she changed something in him. She interrupted the pattern, and maybe that interruption saved someone else. I never imagined this story would unfold over decades, that we'd go from silence to suspicion to something like justice. It wasn't a single moment, it was a long unraveling. Painful, slow, but real. And that's what I've learned most. That sometimes what's taken doesn't come back. But what's hidden doesn't stay hidden forever. If Alicia is still out there, and I allow myself to hope she might be, I hope she knows we didn't stop looking. That we tried. That the truth did come out, even if it took too long. And if she's gone, then I hope she found peace before the end. I hope she knew she was loved. Thank you for listening, for holding space for a name that was almost forgotten. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no child, no truth, and no silence ever gets left behind.